I'm going to start off this video by letting you know that I've been censored, both on YouTube and on Facebook, and I'm sure a lot of you are connecting the dots as to why certain information has been withheld from humanity. So I'm going to get very creative and I'm going to communicate certain truths that resonate for me in the form of a story. And I'll leave the rest up to you to consider and sit with and decipher for yourself, because truth is relative, and whatever stage of awareness anybody is at, it has relevance. Any of my videos were never intended to raise fear, hate, or to be used as permission slips to remain in victimhood. All the information that I've presented in my videos about narcissism was to raise awareness, so you can set yourself free, because I too didn't know the nature of the games that were being played and the crazy making relationships that we each experienced on a personal level are a reflection of what's happening on a global level. And all I'm going to say is that certain things are true regardless of whether you're ready to hear them or not. Once upon a time, when the world was run by psychopaths, controlled by their narcissistic programming, where they intentionally structured systems to fail, to keep humanity dependent, hopeless and helpless. They were driven by an insatiable and pathological need for power and control. They elected themselves to superior status in society as kings, archbishops and prime ministers, but they were tyrants and dictators and very persuasive chameleons. And one of the most cunning ways in which they exerted their control was by messing with humanity's perception, by use of media. They owned the corporations who controlled what people read, saw and watched. Information was censored, and people didn't even know that all of it was half-truth, lies and illusions. So many believed what was spoon-fed to them, but they were gaslit. They were confused, mistrustful. They were told all sorts of lies about their history, their potential as a human race. They slandered and murdered the truth tellers. They were bullies who demanded respect. First, they enslaved humanity physically, and then they imprisoned them psychologically. They practiced medicine. Their medical system placed their doctors in a double bind because they were made to take an oath to first do no harm. Yet their very own statistics revealed an astronomical amount of harm. They invented an authority that was perceived to be more powerful than their own body's ability to heal, and called it the pharmaceutical industry. It was challenging to know even what love and truth was anymore, because of the covert deception that was so prevalent, the subliminal messaging, the malevolent use of symbology that was intentionally and secretly used to hypnotize humans into submission, to affect their subconscious mind. It was all overpowering their connection to their own wisdom. Many doubted their own hearts and whether there was even a divine source. They were both spiritually confused and spiritually abused. The closest and acceptable word that they had was psychopath, a cold, calculating, empathy-devoid being who could embody other humans, shapeshift, and have other paranormal capabilities that would dupe the humans into trusting them time and time again. The more accurate and spiritual terms used by shamans and ascended masters were arrogantly laughed at and dismissed. Most humans would never believe such conspiracy theories, but some had some very personal experiences with what they called demonic entities, which opened their mind to the possibility of other realities. And this is how they remained hidden in plain sight. But eventually, those awakening put two and two together. Most humans, however, panicked because they couldn't perceive with their limited five senses that they actually did have help from other realms. Those humans who could see and sense beyond their limited reality were deemed as crazy, insane, and woo-woo, so they kept quiet, unable to speak the truth of what they had observed. It was interesting to observe how some did believe in angels, guides, and benevolent beings, but they really struggled to believe that the opposite, a malevolent force could exist and influence their physical reality. They argued whether this was the devil or our collective shadow, and this division yet again caused further fragmentation. Precious loving humans were programmed to believe that they are human doings instead of human beings. Some of them did question whether the monetary system was rigged and whether taxation was fraudulent, because the systems were failing and they did not support them in their most vulnerable times. The wealth was not fairly distributed. Most humans were exhausted, overwhelmed with worrying about their survival, and many were chronically ill. The narcissistic, empathy-deficient programming that infiltrated everything in this reality ensured that humanity were all experiencing symptoms of a complex post-traumatic stress. They were coerced to believe that everything was their fault and that they should try harder. Unknowingly, they were busy blaming, hating, and creating more suffering for one another, being completely unaware that their strings were being pulled and their vulnerabilities exploited because they were in this disconnected state. Most humans were objectified, reduced to statistics, seen as replaceable. Most were enslaved to debt they could never repay, and their quality of life was reduced to numbers on a screen. The unique and individual gifts that they each had never got a chance to blossom in this propagated climate of fear. They altered their genes as their food was poisoned, their air was filled with heavy metals, their drinking water was filled with residues of pharmaceutical drugs. They passed laws that protected criminals and scapegoated someone who stole a loaf of bread to feed their hungry child, and used them as an example of their law being just, when all along they played by different rules. Humanity was in a mass cognitive dissonance, as they couldn't comprehend how they were being told one thing, but what was happening before their eyes was completely the opposite. Their politicians said they'd protect their people, but instead enslaved them even more. The rich kept getting richer, and the poor kept getting poorer, and the vulnerable were exploited. The psychopaths at the top of the hierarchy, who thrived because of this conflict and chaos, were busy distracting humanity by staging terrifying world events, scenarios that traumatized people even more and kept them in fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. They existed in survival mode, unable to access their own power, disabled from accessing their wisdom because the fear severed their connection to their heart. The psychopaths' game was conquer and divide, so they propagated conflict amongst people of different skin colours, education, sexes. They kept sowing seeds of hate and doubt, and this kept the people busy fighting each other, never discovering the cause of all their apparent problems, while the psychopaths just stole, pillaged, and mercilessly took everything from humanity behind the scenes. They changed even more laws and violated their basic human rights for clean food, unpolluted water, and a safe place to call home. Many humans awoke as they experienced some of this dynamic on a personal level. They recognized the narcissist in their life. They had a very personal experience of the type of hell an empty shell of a human being can inflict. For a long time, they were enmeshed in their own private replays, and this too distracted them for longer. They tried to heal them, save them, understand them, and offer them endless compassion, none of which had any effect whatsoever, but just increased their enmeshment in this web of deceit and delayed their own empowerment and freedom by focusing on things externally. The narcissistic psychopaths infected people with their programming, rewarded them for behaving in inhumane ways, and many were unaware that they were behaving in exactly the ways the psychopaths hoped and planned. They instilled disempowering beliefs in them that few questioned. It was survival of the fittest. They believed in competition instead of cooperation because they were convinced that there was not enough to go around. They were stuck in the lack matrix. They couldn't see that it was never a question of supply, but distribution. Their minds were permanently inflicted with guilt, fear, and shame. And the psychopaths used diversion tactics to avoid any responsibility or ever being found out. And anyone who had a heart was baffled as to why were they doing this? What is the root of their insatiable need for power? Why were they hell-bent on causing so much harm, pain and suffering to the humans, animals and environment? They finally concluded it was evil, it was inhumane, it was not human. Because what defined them as human was their heart and the ability to love, which they didn't know was their superpower and the key that could set them free from this matrix. They were indoctrinated to confuse love with attention, love with abuse, and love with control. And these were all inversions. It was just a matter of awareness and choice, and a dedication to integrate all that they experienced, all the transgenerational traumas, and be able to still be open and choose love. They were provoked in every possible way to continuously keep choosing fear over love. Humanity was unable to understand for a really long time all these wars, battles, fighting to survive, until one day they did. And the fear that was intentionally used to subjugate them dissipated instantly when they revisited the words of an ascended master who said, "Fear not, for you are not wrestling with flesh and blood, but against powers, the rulers of darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." And when humanity felt the truth of these words within the fibre of their being, and that it was a battle for consciousness, when they knew that their intuition was always right, that they were always worthy and deserving, that they had great goodness at their core and didn't have to prove or fight to exist, that's when the Great Awakening began. As more and more truths began to be revealed, the way showers, truth tellers, and light workers began to feel overwhelmed. But they didn't know that there were many like them in those systems who were ready to speak, ready to share all that they were suppressed to share. Those on the inside revealed even more shattering truths that eventuated in those who committed crimes against humanity to be held accountable. The people ceased fighting against each other and instead embraced one another, and their love, forgiveness, and compassion healed and resolved all their wounds. Humanity was finally free. The malevolent invisible forces that influenced the narcissistic psychopaths could no longer reside in this reality, for the vibration of love was too great, and humanity had mastered the lower frequencies of guilt, fear, and shame that had kept them imprisoned. Humanity felt relief unlike they'd ever had before, and it inspired great action. New systems were put in place. They rebuilt even stronger and better structures that sustained humanity, that nurtured all those who so desperately needed love and support. Technologies that were previously suppressed were finally revealed, and humanity accelerated in an unprecedented manner. Cures from illnesses that were previously labelled as incurable, that were secretly patented, were openly given to all those suffering from the incurable. There was no more secrecy, but transparency. The humans who always knew what was right and wrong, who incarnated specifically to witness this change, those who were mocked, shamed, and belittled, the sensitive ones, the intuitives, the shamans, and the alchemists, they were acknowledged and celebrated for their resilience and unfaltering heart-centered belief that this would always come true. And they all cherished every living being because each of them carried the spark of divine light, which was crucial to the restoration of heaven on earth. And this was the greatest story that was ever told. And they wholeheartedly treasured the wisdom that they gained because of these extreme contrasts. They realized it was all an illusion, a mistaken belief in separation, and their level of consciousness determined what they'd experienced. If they vibrated at love, all they experienced was love. But if they vibrated at fear, then what was reflected were more fearful experiences. They'd created this to wake themselves up. There was no duality. There was no us versus them. It was all us. Some called it the Golden Age of Aquarius, some called it Christ consciousness, and others called it ascending to 5D. But it was all unity consciousness. They were all correct, and they all knew that they'd arrived and finished what they had volunteered to do, which was always to just be and to hold the space for peace and love. Some volunteers finally went home to their galactic families. Others chose to stay to be the teachers, builders, facilitators on this new earth, and they lovingly continued sharing their gifts and holding humanity's hand, and peace was once again restored in this quadrant of the universe, in this time-space reality. Please remember that beliefs shape our reality. You get to choose what you focus on, what you get stuck on, and how the story ends.